Hey guys, tonight, we're taking a quiet walk through history, a walk that leads us right into the grand halls of the Vatican, where the air smells like old incense, ancient stone, and, sometimes, very questionable decision-making. Yes. Tonight we ask a bold question. What exactly makes a pope one of the worst? Now, before we dive in, let's get one thing clear: this isn't about mocking faith or making fun of religion. The papacy is one of the oldest, most influential institutions in human history. Many popes have been wise, humble, and genuinely devoted to doing good. But some popes were basically the medieval version of "this is why we can't have nice things." And that contrast, between the sacred role and the all-too-human failings, is exactly why this topic pulls us in. It's like watching a historical drama where the actors never realized they were in a drama. The story of the worst popes is the story of what happens when huge spiritual authority mixes with ambition, greed, or just plain chaos. And sometimes, that mix explodes in spectacular ways. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's set the stage for the wild centuries ahead. Why even examine the worst? Think of the papacy as this giant lighthouse sitting over the centuries, steady, glowing, pointing the way. But every now and then, the lighthouse keeper fell asleep, or threw a party, or sold the lighthouse tower to his cousin, or declared war on another lighthouse. Studying the worst popes helps us understand how human flaws can affect entire nations, wars, cultures, and beliefs. Their mistakes shaped laws, kingdoms, economies, and even the map of Europe. And honestly, some of these stories are so strange, so dramatic, and so unbelievably real that they could keep even the sleepiest listener awake with one raised eyebrow. What makes a pope bad? There's no official Vatican chart that ranks popes like video game bosses. So for this series, we'll use a very simple set of criteria. Basically, a pope had to be involved in at least one of the following categories of, let's say, creative life choices. 1. Moral corruption. This can mean anything from living like a king, to breaking vows, to doing things that make historians pause and go, wait. He did what now? 2. Political obsession. Some popes were less like spiritual leaders and more like chess players moving armies across Europe. Except instead of chess pieces, they used actual people. 3. Violence. Yes, there were popes who ordered torture, war, and even murder. Some popes fought battles in armor. Others sent assassins. A few might have even poisoned rivals. You know. Very holy things. 4. Nepotism. Ah, yes. The classic move, God wants my nephew to run everything. Some popes filled church positions with brothers, cousins, and children. Yes. Children. We will talk about that later. Buckle up. 5. Simony. This is the fancy word for selling sacred things. Some popes literally sold church offices like they were running a medieval Black Friday sale. 6. Scandal. From affairs to secret families to absolute nonsense that deserves its own popcorn bowl, scandals were not rare. Of course, not every pope who dipped into these categories becomes a top-tier, worst pope. But when a pope checks multiple boxes, that's when things get interesting. A quick trip across the centuries. The papacy has existed for nearly 2,000 years. Across that time, the world changed in massive ways. Roman emperors rose and fell, kingdoms were born, empires collapsed, and entire continents were reshaped. And through all of that, the Pope remained a central figure, balancing spiritual guidance with political responsibility. But here's the thing. The more power you hold, the more temptation creeps in. And the medieval and Renaissance periods? Oh, those were basically temptation theme parks. Wealth everywhere. No police oversight. Everyone fighting for power. Plots and counterplots behind every curtain. Poison in a lot of wine cups. And a whole world where the line between religious leader and political king was extremely blurry. So, naturally, some popes took full advantage of the chaos. In this series, we'll travel through those centuries to meet the popes who left the biggest stains on the papal record. Some will shock you. Some will confuse you. Some will make you slowly lower your tea and whisper, "What was he thinking?" Preview of the infamous cast. Without giving away too many spoilers, let me gently introduce you to a few names you should prepare for. Pope Stephen VI. A man so furious at his dead predecessor that he dug up the corpse and put it on trial. Yes. A literal trial. The dead Pope courtroom. You'll hear the whole story soon. Pope Benedict IX. Imagine if a spoiled teenager suddenly became the CEO of the Catholic Church. Then imagine that teenager selling the job to someone else because he wanted money. Then imagine him trying to take the job back. This actually happened. 3 times. Pope Alexander VI. The Borgia Pope. Politics. Poison. Luxury. Scandal. Forbidden romances. Renaissance drama at its peak. If this were a Netflix series, it would be the one everyone binge-watches and pretends they haven't. And believe me, they're just the beginning. The Papal Hall of Fame has some truly wild stories hiding behind the stained glass windows. The Great Tension, authority versus power. Every time we look at one of these worst popes, we'll be watching this huge historical tug-of-war between spiritual authority and temporal power. A pope is supposed to guide souls, preach peace, defend the weak, and be a symbol of purity and service. But a pope also controlled armies, land, taxes, diplomacy, and the entire legal system of the Church. And that power, very real, very tempting, pulled some popes right off the spiritual path and into the messiest political battles of their time. That tension is what makes these stories so fascinating. It's why we're still talking about these popes centuries later. They weren't just bad leaders. They were symbols of what happens when power grows too large for one pair of human hands. What to expect next? In the next chapters, we'll go deeper, one pope at a time, unpacking their backgrounds, their ambitions, their mistakes, and the chaos they left behind. Some chapters will feel like historical crime shows. Others will feel like political thrillers. A few might feel like dark comedies. But through it all, we'll keep a calm, storytelling tone, guiding you through each tale like a bedtime history companion. Because even the strangest stories can help us understand the world a little better, and help us fall asleep with a head full of curious thoughts. So take a deep breath. Settle in. And get ready. Because the history of the worst popes? It's wilder than fiction. And we're only just opening the door. The Saeculum Obscurum, Rome's Dark Century. If you've ever had a rough century, don't worry, Rome once had one too. And it even gave it a dramatic Latin name, Saeculum Obscurum, which basically means, the Dark Age or the Dark Century. Now, when medieval people describe something as dark, you know it's serious, because these folks already lived without electricity, indoor heating, or Wi-Fi. So for them to stop and say, yeah, this era was extra bad, you know things got messy. The Saeculum Obscurum covers roughly the 10th century, and in papal history, it's the period everybody politely avoids at parties. It's the time when Rome wasn't exactly run by holy men, but rather by powerful families who treated the papacy like a family business. Think of it as a medieval version of a political soap opera, except with fewer commercial breaks and more swords. This chapter sets the vibe: political chaos, scheming nobles, popes coming and going faster than you can say, amen, and a papal throne that feels more like a chair in a wrestling ring. So, let's stroll, chill and comfy, into the shadows of Rome's darkest century. A century with the lights off. The Saeculum Obscurum wasn't called dark because of demons or eclipses or any of that fun medieval stuff. It was dark because the papacy lost nearly all independence. Instead of church leaders guiding Rome, aristocratic clans pulled the strings. The line between holy office and political pawn pretty much evaporated. Back then, the papal throne was one of the most powerful positions in Europe. But instead of being filled by spiritual giants, it was often controlled by families who saw it as a strategic asset, like having a cousin who's the manager at a popular restaurant and getting free meals for life. This century gives us a parade of popes who simply didn't fit the normal, holy shepherd vibe. Some were teenagers. Some had lovers. Some were forced out, murdered, bribed, or replaced like they were characters written out of a TV show after the first season. Rome itself was unstable, constantly shifting between political factions. And in the middle of all this stood the church, wobbling like a candle in a storm. Rome's real bosses, the aristocratic powerhouse families. Let's talk about the Theophylacti, the ultimate medieval power couple. If there were tabloids in the 10th century, these folks would be on the cover every week. Their family practically dominated Rome, and whether you loved them or hated them, you definitely couldn't ignore them. The main players were Theophylact I, the military big shot who held titles like Count of Tusculum and Senator of the Romans, basically, the guy who walked into a room and everyone else suddenly stood up straighter. Theodora, his wife, known for her influence, ambition, and political sharpness. Marozia, their daughter, who became one of the most powerful women in papal history. She's often described, a bit dramatically, as the woman who controlled Rome through her lovers, husbands, and sons. Whether that's fair or a medieval exaggeration, the point is simple: the Theophylacti were everywhere. Their goal wasn't to protect the church, they wanted political power. And if making one of their favorites pope helped with that, then hey, why not? Rome at this time wasn't the grand imperial capital it used to be. The old empire had crumbled long ago. Nobles filled the power vacuum, building local networks and rivalries. The church was stuck in the middle of these power struggles, like a prize everyone wanted to grab. How the papacy got tangled in the web. The papacy during the Saeculum Obscurum became a prize, something to control, to pass along, to manipulate. The office wasn't treated as a spiritual responsibility, it was treated like political real estate. Here's how it usually worked. A powerful noble family gained military dominance. They installed a pope who supported their interests. That pope, often young, inexperienced, or simply overwhelmed, would rule in name, while the family made the real decisions. Rivals tried to overthrow them. The pope was forced out, imprisoned, or quietly removed. Next pope, same cycle. The Theophylacti weren't the only ones involved, but they were the champions of the game. Their reach was so deep that some popes were connected to them not just politically but biologically. The papacy basically became a medieval version of who's running the church today? Whichever noble family got there first this week. Popes themselves struggled to act independently. They couldn't enforce reforms. They couldn't confront corruption. They couldn't even travel safely outside Rome. The secular world had tied the papacy up so tightly that spiritual leadership came second to family politics. By this point, you might already be thinking, wow, this is messy. Oh, just wait. The popes of the Dark Century, a not-so-holy parade. This era gifted history with popes who are, let's say, memorable. Not for miracles or theology, but for everything a pope shouldn't be remembered for. Many of them were caught in scandals, political games, or outright abuses of power. Here are a few of the most iconic figures. Pope John XI, r. 931 to 935. He was reportedly the son of Marozia, possibly fathered by Pope Sergius III. Yes, you heard that correctly, a pope may have fathered another future pope. Medieval genealogy is wild. Whether these claims are exaggerated or not, John XI became pope while his mother effectively ruled Rome behind the scenes. Pope Sergius III, r. 904 to 911. He didn't exactly earn his place through peaceful prayer. He returned to Rome with military force, deposed his rival, and, according to some sources, was involved in the notorious Cadaver Synod, where a dead pope was put on trial. Yes, they literally dug up a corpse, dressed it up, and held a trial. Rome was not boring. Pope John XII, r. 955 to 964. Perhaps the most infamous of them all. He became pope at age 18, which tells you a lot already. Contemporary writers describe his papal palace as if it were a medieval frat house: gambling, parties, questionable visitors, the whole package. One chronicler said the Lateran Palace became a brothel. That might be an exaggeration, but a very spicy one. John XII also loved hunting, fighting, and disrespecting the rules of the Church. His papacy ended the same way it was lived, abruptly and chaotically. Reports say he died during, shall we say, non-church-related activities. Medieval writers definitely enjoyed adding extra drama to his story. Power, decay, and a papacy on the edge. What makes the Saeculum Obscurum so significant isn't just the individual scandals. It's the bigger picture. The institution of the papacy, supposed to be the moral center of Western Christianity, was trapped in a spiral of political interference, family alliances, violence and bribery, moral decline, elections driven by force instead of faith. Instead of being a guiding spiritual lighthouse, the papacy was barely keeping its head above the political waters of Rome. It's easy to judge these popes harshly, but in some ways, they were products of their environment. Surrounded by noble families fighting for dominance, lacking stable protection, and pressured into alliances, the papacy simply couldn't stand on its own. The result was a century that later reformers looked back on and said, yeah, let's never do that again. And those reforms did come, in time. But before the dawn, Rome had to survive this long, chaotic, shadowy chapter. Closing thoughts. The Saeculum Obscurum was Rome's dark century, a time when aristocratic families climbed onto the papal throne through influence, marriage, manipulation, and sometimes straight-up force. The Church, instead of leading Europe spiritually, found itself tangled in politics so deep that it nearly lost its way. But history remembers this century not just for the scandals, but for the lesson it left behind. When spiritual authority gets too cozy with political power, the results can get very messy. And with that, we close the curtains on Rome's dark century, and get ready for the next chapter of this bedtime journey through history's wildest moments. Pope John X, Puppet and Scandal. If the Saeculum Obscurum was a medieval reality show, then Pope John X would be one of its most dramatic cast members. His life has everything: political ambitions, rumors of romance, noble families pulling strings, and a finale that feels like it came out of a dark historical drama. But here, we're keeping it chill, so think of this as the bedtime story version of a papal scandal. John X lived during one of the roughest times to be pope. Rome was ruled less by holy men and more by powerful clans, and John somehow walked right into the middle of it all. Depending on which medieval writer you ask, he was either a decent, ambitious guy who tried to help Italy, or a greedy, lustful puppet who would sacrifice everything to his passions. Honestly, the truth is somewhere in between, but medieval gossip does not hold back. So let's settle in and explore the life of Pope John X, one of history's most complicated popes, wrapped in rumors, power plays, and enough drama to fill a whole season. John X, the man behind the mitre. Before he became pope, John wasn't just a random church official wandering around Rome. He had a reputation as a smart, effective leader, especially in Ravenna. People respected him for his brains, not just the fancy robes he would later wear. But here's where things get interesting: his rise to power is deeply tangled with Theodora, the influential wife of Theophylact, one of the top power brokers in Rome. And depending on which source you read, John X rose because he was talented, or because Theodora liked him in ways beyond politics. Medieval writers couldn't resist a juicy story, so many of them said John X became pope because Theodora wanted him there. A few chroniclers even claimed they were lovers. Is it true? Maybe. Maybe not. But it's the kind of rumor that sticks for 1,000 years. What we do know is this: the Theophylacti family liked John, supported him, and helped him climb up the ladder. And during the 10th century, having their support was like having the best agent in Hollywood. You suddenly got all the roles. Theodora, the woman in the shadows. To understand John X's story, you have to understand Theodora, one of the most powerful women in Roman history. Forget the later gossip painting her as a seductive mastermind, just focus on the basics. She had influence, connections, money, and the kind of political muscle that made aristocrats sweat. She and her husband Theophylact were basically running Rome during this period. So when Theodora decided someone useful should be pushed upward, chances were high it would happen. According to some sources, she'd made John X pope. Not recommended as a modern resume entry, but back then, it got the job done. Whether they were lovers or just political allies, she clearly played a big role in his rise. And once he became pope in 914, the Theophylacti expected him to stay friendly and loyal. Rise of a puppet, or a power player? So, was John X just a puppet on strings? Maybe partly. But he wasn't boring or passive. He actually tried to run things, not just wait for orders from the Roman nobility. Here are some things he actually did. He worked hard to push back foreign threats, especially the Saracens in southern Italy. He helped in forming an alliance of Italian rulers to fight off those invaders. He even joined a military campaign. Yes, the Pope marched into battle, which you don't see very often in Vatican job descriptions. So yeah, John X did stuff. A lot of stuff. But his independence also made the Theophylacti uneasy. Puppets are supposed to stay quiet. John didn't. Historical sources, truth or spicy propaganda? This is where things get complicated. We rely on medieval chroniclers to tell us what happened, but they weren't exactly unbiased. Some were loyal to the Theophylacti. Some hated them. Some just loved a good scandal. Here's the main problem: most of the negative stuff about John X, lust, greed, being Theodora's pet project, comes from sources written decades after his death, often by authors who wanted to paint the entire Saeculum Obscurum as a total nightmare. Basically, imagine trying to learn the truth about someone from angry Facebook posts written years later. So how much of it is propaganda? The relationship with Theodora? Might be true, or might be political smearing. Accusations of being controlled? He definitely depended on the Theophylacti, but he also acted independently. Claims about greed and lust? Hard to verify. Medieval writers loved accusing people of that. It was their version of, "this guy is problematic." John X certainly wasn't a saint, but he probably wasn't the cartoon villain some sources describe. Historians today try to balance the stories. Some say he was ambitious. Others say he was a reformer stuck in a corrupt world. Others say he was just unlucky. One thing is clear: he was way too interesting to be a simple puppet. A reputation painted in dark colors. Whatever the truth, John X earned a heavy reputation. Writers described him with a mix of shock, disappointment, and a dash of medieval sass. Common themes. Greedy, accused of hoarding wealth, though most popes at the time were accused of this. Lustful, tied to Theodora and other women in rumors, even though we have zero solid evidence. Puppet, seen as controlled by the Theophylacti, even when he tried to show independence. Sacrificing everything to his passions, a very dramatic way of saying he liked power, or possibly people. It's interesting that these accusations come mostly from writers who were hostile to the Roman aristocracy as a whole. For them, every pope connected to the Theophylacti was automatically guilty. If John X had never worked with the family, his reputation might look very different today. History is funny like that. His downfall, when the game turns. John X's downfall is one of the most tragic and brutal parts of his story. And like everything in the Saeculum Obscurum, it was driven by family politics, specifically, by Marozia, Theodora's daughter. Marozia had taken over her mother's political role in Rome. She wasn't interested in keeping John X around, especially since he wasn't obedient enough. She wanted a pope who would follow her script, not write his own. So she made a move. In 928, Marozia's forces entered Rome. John X was arrested. His brother, who tried to defend him, was killed. John was locked in prison, where he died, either from mistreatment, suffocation, or simply neglect. The chroniclers can't agree, but none of the options are pleasant. His fall shows how dangerous the papacy had become. Being pope wasn't a shield. It was a bullseye. Legacy, how history remembers him. John X's legacy is blurry, wrapped in rumor, propaganda, and the chaos of his era. Contemporaries were split. Some respected him for fighting off threats and trying to bring stability. Others despised him because of his connection to the Theophylacty. A few described him with pure bitterness, painting him as a symbol of corruption. Later historians also differ. Older writers saw him as proof of how bad the Saeculum Obscurum was. Modern historians look at him more kindly, saying he was skilled, ambitious, and partly a victim of aristocratic power games. He was no saint. But he wasn't the villain some sources claim. He was a man caught between ambition, politics, and one very powerful family. In the end, John X is remembered as a pope who tried to steer Rome forward, and got crushed by the very forces that helped him rise. His life is a reminder that during the dark century of the papacy, even the most determined leaders could disappear in the shadows. And with that, we close this chapter, chill but honest, on one of the most dramatic popes of Rome's dark age. Pope Sergius III, murder, nepotism, and power. If the Saeculum Obscurum was a stormy medieval roller coaster, then Pope Sergius III was one of the twists no one saw coming. His life story mixes murder, ambition, family politics, and some very questionable decisions. Basically, if history had a Most Dramatic Pope of the Month award, Sergius III would have won multiple times. This chapter takes us into the world of a man who fought his way to the papacy, literally. His rise included violence, alliances with powerful nobles, and a reputation soaked in controversy. Some call him a villain, others call him a survivor. Either way, he definitely wasn't boring. So grab a blanket, lean back, and let's dig into the chill but chaotic life of Pope Sergius III. The early life of a fighter. Sergius didn't come from nowhere. He was born into a noble Roman family, which helped him get into church life early. But even as a young man, he wasn't exactly the soft-spoken priest type. Rome during this period was basically a live-action battlefield between political factions, and Sergius grew up right in the middle of it. By the time he became a bishop, Sergius had already made friends and enemies among Rome's power players. And this is important, because relationships in this era could either lift you onto the papal throne or throw you into a dungeon. Sometimes both. The Cadaver Synod, Sergius steps into the chaos. Before we get to Sergius as pope, we have to talk about one of the wildest events in church history, the Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI had the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dug up, propped on a throne, and put on trial. A literal trial. With a corpse. Dressed in papal clothes. Rome had peak drama energy. Sergius was involved in this bizarre event, supporting the trial and benefiting from Formosus' downfall. This would come back to haunt him later, but for now, it placed him firmly in the aggressive political operator category. Rome at this time was split between two camps. Those who supported Formosus. Those who wanted his memory erased. Sergius was in the second group. And when the political tide shifted against him, he had to flee the city. But don't worry, our guy was not done yet. The rise through violence and alliances. For a while, Sergius lived in exile, waiting for the right moment to return. That moment came when the Theophylacti family, yes, the same powerhouse clan from earlier chapters, decided they needed a pope who would play along with their plans. Enter Theophylact I, the strongman of Rome. He needed a dependable ally on the throne. Sergius needed muscle and money. Perfect match. In 904, Sergius returned to Rome, backed by Theophylact's forces, and took the papal throne by force. The sitting pope, Leo V, didn't stand a chance. Some sources say Leo was deposed. Others say imprisoned. A few claim murdered. The records are fuzzy, but one thing is clear: Sergius didn't politely wait his turn. So boom, Pope Sergius III officially begins. Murder and ruthlessness, his reputation begins. Once in power, Sergius acted fast to remove rivals. Rome was dangerous, and if a pope hesitated, he didn't survive long. His biggest political enemy was Christopher, who had claimed the papacy before Sergius. Christopher was captured, imprisoned, and probably killed. Some lists even label him an antipope, meaning fake pope. That wasn't unusual. 10th century Rome was full of popes, depending on who your friends were. Whether Sergius personally ordered the killings is uncertain, but his name is forever linked to violence. In medieval chronicles, he appears as a man who used force like a tool. If peace didn't work, he'd switch to more permanent solutions. Nepotism and Theophylacti influence. Once comfortably seated, Sergius III became deeply tied to the Theophylacti family. Theophylact and his wife Theodora essentially ran Rome, and Sergius ruled with their blessing. The relationship was so tight that some historians say he was more like their employee than an independent pope. This is also where the famous rumor appears. The idea that Sergius had a relationship with Theodora, resulting in a son who later became Pope John XI. It's a spicy story and medieval writers loved repeating it. Is it true? Hard to say. Some sources claim it confidently, others say it's pure political slander. But the rumor followed Sergius for centuries because it fit the narrative: corruption, pleasure, favoritism, all wrapped in power. Whatever the truth, Sergius showed tons of nepotistic vibes, favoring allies, promoting Theophylacti supporters, and letting the family tighten their grip on Rome. The papacy during his reign was basically a side character in the Theophylacti political show. Power consolidated, a pope with sharp edges. Even with all the scandal, Sergius wasn't a lazy ruler. He reorganized church property, restored churches destroyed by earlier conflicts, and tried to bring some stability to Rome. The problem is that his methods were intense. He reversed every decision made by one of his rivals, Pope Formosus, continuing the messy legacy of the Cadaver Synod drama. This upset a lot of people and created fresh enemies. But Sergius didn't mind making enemies. He had Theophylact's support, and that was enough. He also made sure the church aligned with the aristocracy. If you were part of Rome's elite, Sergius was a great pope for you. If you weren't, well, good luck. His court wasn't exactly a model of holiness either. Chroniclers described it as filled with corruption and worldly pleasures, which is medieval code for party vibes and bad decisions. The scandalous image: truth versus gossip. So let's talk about how much of Sergius III's bad boy reputation is fact, and how much is medieval tabloid material. True or likely true. He took the papacy by force. Christopher was removed and probably killed. He was backed by the Theophylacti. His rule strengthened noble control over Rome. He reversed the acts of Formosus. Uncertain, but widely repeated. He had an affair with Theodora. He fathered Pope John XI. He personally ordered various murders. His court was sinful or immoral in specific ways. Medieval chroniclers often wrote with agendas. If they disliked a pope, they turned the drama dial to max. Sergius, who sided with one faction, became the perfect villain for writers from the other side. But even with exaggerations removed, it's still clear, Sergius wasn't a gentle leader. He was a fighter and survivor who treated the papal throne as a strategic power seat. The final years, power stays close to home. Sergius ruled for about 7 years, which is impressive considering how chaotic Rome was. He died in 911, peacefully, surprisingly enough. No assassination, no battle, just natural death. Maybe even he got tired of the drama. After his death, Theophylact's influence remained, setting up the political world that future popes like John X would also struggle with. Sergius left behind a Rome where the church was more dependent on aristocratic families than ever. His rule didn't fix the darkness of the era, it deepened it. Legacy, a villain? A survivor? Something in between? How do historians judge a man like Sergius III? Well, it depends who you ask. Older scholars painted him as a corrupt monster. Modern historians are a bit gentler, calling him ambitious, ruthless, and shaped by the violent world around him. Medieval writers made him the bad guy of the century, guilty of murder, lust, and every sin they could think of. The truth? He was a tough political figure in a system where kindness got you killed. He didn't create the corruption, he just played the game better than most. His name still pops up whenever people talk about the church's darkest moments. And yes, he deserves some of that blame. But he also represents the reality of a century where survival required sharp edges. In the end, Sergius III stands as one of the most controversial popes in history, a symbol of murder, nepotism, and raw power. A man who climbed to the top using force, and held on with both hands until the very last day. And with that, we close this chapter, keeping things chill while walking through one of the most intense papacies in the Dark Century. Pope Stephen VI and the Cadaver Synod. If you thought the last chapters were wild, buckle up. This one goes beyond scandal. It goes beyond corruption. It goes all the way into the territory of, wait, they really did what? Welcome to the story of Pope Stephen VI and the infamous Cadaver Synod, one of the strangest, most unsettling events in church history. And we're talking all of history here. When medieval writers call something insane, you know it's next level. This is the chapter where we meet a pope who literally dragged his predecessor back into court from beyond the grave. No metaphor. No symbolism. A literal corpse, dressed up, propped on a chair, put on trial, questioned, and punished. So grab your blanket. Maybe also a cup of tea for emotional support. We're going into the darkest courtroom in Rome. Pope Stephen VI, the man behind the madness. Stephen VI became pope in 896, during one of the messiest political moments of the Dark Century. He wasn't a naturally chaotic person, at least not from what we know. But he was caught between powerful factions in Rome, especially the families who hated Pope Formosus. Formosus had been pope before Stephen, and he made a lot of enemies during his life. Some disliked his alliances. Others hated his decisions. And some simply never wanted him to become pope at all. In the unstable world of Rome, grudges didn't fade, they fermented. Stephen became the leader of a faction that believed Formosus had no right to be pope. And instead of writing an angry letter or venting to friends like a normal politician, Stephen went big. Very big. He ordered Formosus' corpse, dead for about 9 months, to be dug up. This was not a popular idea, even in the 10th century. But Stephen pushed forward anyway, setting the stage for one of the strangest trials ever recorded. The setup, a courtroom with a corpse. Imagine the scene. The Lateran Basilica. A crowd of stunned and confused clergy. The smell of incense mixed with the smell of, well, a 9-month-old corpse. And in the center, the dead Pope Formosus, dressed in full papal robes, sitting in a throne-like chair. Stephen VI stood next to him, ready to act as prosecutor. Some poor deacon, basically the world's unluckiest in turn, was forced to act as the corpse's defense lawyer. His job was to answer questions on behalf of a body that absolutely could not answer. If there were awards for most hopeless job of the Middle Ages, this guy would have won. The trial began. The Cadaver Synod, how to try a dead man. The charges against Formosus were dramatic. He became pope illegally. He broke church rules before becoming pope. He committed perjury. He shifted alliances too often. These accusations weren't new, they were political weapons that had existed for years. But putting a dead man on trial wasn't exactly the standard approach. Stephen VI yelled the accusations while the corpse sat silently. Witnesses were brought forward. The deacon mumbled whatever defense he could think of. It was a spectacle, half horror, half cruelty, a little bit political theater, and a lot of what is happening right now. In the end, the verdict was predictable, guilty on all charges. Then came the punishment. The punishment, defrocking and defingering. After declaring the corpse guilty, Stephen VI ordered a series of symbolic punishments. 1. Stripping the robes. Formosus' corpse was dragged off the throne and stripped of the papal garments. This was meant to undo his time as pope, as if peeling away the outfit erased his legacy. 2. Cutting off the blessing fingers. The first 2 fingers of his right hand, the ones used for giving blessings, were chopped off. This punishment wasn't subtle. It basically screamed, "Your blessings were invalid, and we want everyone to know it." Medieval symbolism, 10/10. Respect for the dead, absolutely 0 out of 10. 3. Throwing the body away. First, they tossed the corpse into a graveyard for foreigners. Then someone decided even that was too respectful, so the body was dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River. It was the medieval equivalent of unfriending someone and blocking all their social accounts, then deleting their profile entirely. But, in true dramatic fashion, the corpse didn't stay gone. According to some stories, the body washed ashore and was secretly recovered by monks. People began saying miracles started near the body, turning Formosus, from beyond the grave, into a sort of spiritual rebel. Symbolism and motivation. What was Stephen thinking? Why did Stephen VI do this? Was he just angry? Was he mentally unstable? Or was this something deeper? Historians give a few explanations. 1. Political vengeance. The anti-Formosus faction wanted revenge. Formosus had supported rival families. He had crowned kings his enemies didn't like. He'd stirred the political pot too many times. Putting his corpse on trial was a massive act of payback. It said to the world, Formosus never deserved to rule, and we're erasing him from history. 2. Power play. Stephen needed to show loyalty to his backers, the faction that got him the papacy. The Cadaver Synod was his way of proving he was on their team, no matter how extreme the action. 3. Legal symbolism. Medieval people believed political legitimacy came through public judgment. Even the dead could be corrected by the law. It sounds wild today, but back then, trials like this, though extremely rare, were not completely unheard of. The goal wasn't justice. It was image control. 4. Possible instability. Some chroniclers suggest Stephen wasn't mentally stable during this period. He may have been pressured, paranoid, or simply overwhelmed. His actions were extreme even by 10th century standards. So was it personal vengeance, political theater, or something deeper? Honestly, it was all three mixed together into one very dark spectacle. The backlash. Rome has had enough. The Cadaver Synod shocked Rome. Even people used to political violence were disturbed. Clergy whispered that the trial went too far. Citizens murmured that Stephen had cursed the church. The idea of digging up a pope and humiliating him horrified many. It made the papacy look unstable, vengeful, and chaotic. Stephen felt the pressure almost immediately. Stephen VI's fall from power. Just a few months after the Cadaver Synod, Rome erupted in anger. A huge uprising broke out. Citizens and clergy stormed Rome's political centers, shouting for Stephen's removal. Stephen tried to escape the backlash, but his enemies were already moving. He was imprisoned by rebels, ironic, considering how he had imprisoned the corpse of his predecessor. A few months later, in 897, Stephen was strangled in his cell. His rule ended with the same violence he once directed at Formosus. Long-term impact, a papacy in crisis. The Cadaver Synod didn't just ruin Stephen VI, it damaged the reputation of the entire church. 1. Rapid reversals. The next pope reversed every decision Stephen had made. Formosus was reburied with honor. The fingers were reattached, symbolically, of course, and the official stance became, "Let's pretend that whole thing never happened." 2. Damage to papal authority. People outside Rome looked at the chaos and thought, if popes are digging up other popes and putting them on trial, what is going on over there? It weakened trust in the papacy and made the church look like a battleground rather than a spiritual center. 3. Future generations never forgot. Even today, the Cadaver Synod stands as a symbol of how dark and absurd the Saeculum Obscurum became. It was a moment when politics swallowed faith, when spectacle replaced leadership, and when personal vengeance was carried out under the banner of holy authority. Closing thoughts. Pope Stephen VI didn't intend to become the star of one of history's strangest and most disturbing events. But the Cadaver Synod cemented his legacy forever. His decision to put a corpse on trial wasn't just bizarre, it was a warning about what happens when power, fear, and political pressure overwhelm reason. It toppled Stephen, scarred the papacy, and became one of the darkest symbols of Rome's chaotic century. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still grounded, but with full respect for the sheer absurdity of one of history's wildest courtrooms. Pope John XII, the teenage tyrant. Some popes are remembered for their wisdom. Some for reforms. Some for bravery. And then there's Pope John XII, who is mainly remembered for being, well, a medieval disaster. Imagine giving absolute power to an 18-year-old who already grew up surrounded by riches, political scheming, and zero discipline. Now imagine that teenager ruling Rome. Congratulations, you've just unlocked the general vibe of John XII's papacy. This chapter takes us into the life of the young pope who partied harder than he prayed, gambled more than he governed, and left behind a legacy so chaotic that even medieval writers were like, yeah, this guy was too much. Let's settle in, stay chill, and look at the teenage tyrant of the Saeculum Obscurum. A young pope in a dangerous world. John XII wasn't born into peace. He came from the powerful Crescentii Theophylacti clan, a family that practically ran Rome like a private business. His birth name was Octavian, which already sounds like someone destined to cause drama. His father, Alberic II, was the real ruler of Rome, prince, commander, and political boss. Before dying, Alberic forced the Roman nobles to swear an oath that Octavian would become the next pope. No spiritual qualifications needed. Just pure family power. So in 955, at just 18 years old, Octavian became Pope John XII. Most teenagers worry about school exams or who they're texting. John XII suddenly had control over the church, Rome, lands, armies, and lots of money. It was like giving a teenager a kingdom and saying, do your best. Spoiler, he did not do his best. Scandalous behavior, the party pope. John XII wasn't interested in spiritual discipline. Or church reform. Or moral leadership. Or even pretending. He basically turned the papal palace into a medieval party hub. According to chroniclers, who, to be fair, loved dramatic writing, the Lateran palace became something like the ultimate, no-rules, house. Gambling day and night. Drinking like he was trying to win a contest. Romantic encounters with basically anyone he found interesting. Hunting trips that went on too long. Ignoring church business because it was boring. Inviting questionable visitors into the palace. Writers claimed he didn't just break church rules, he shattered them. One said the palace became a brothel. Another wrote that he toasted to the devil, probably an exaggeration, but still wild. Is every accusation true? Probably not. Medieval writers often added extra spice. But even if half of it is true, John XII was clearly not living the Pope life by the book. He was a teenager with unlimited power and absolutely no boundaries. His dual role, secular prince versus spiritual leader. Being Pope wasn't just a religious job in the 10th century. The Pope was also a secular prince, ruler of territories, commander of troops, and political figure who negotiated with kings. John XII liked the prince part. He had no interest in the spiritual leader part. He danced between being a political boss and a party-loving pope, switching roles depending on what suited him. He granted land, made deals, and fought against rival nobles. Sometimes he tried to act serious and authoritative. But then he'd vanish for a hunting trip or bring questionable guests into the palace. Rome was chaotic during his rule because John XII didn't know how to balance the church's needs with his desire for fun. The nobility tolerated him because he was from their own clan. But foreign rulers? Not so much. That's where Otto I, King of the Germans, and soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, enters the picture. Calling for help, John XII invites Otto I. John XII got into political trouble early. Rivals threatened his territory. The Italian kings were unpredictable. So John made a bold move, he invited King Otto I to Italy for military support. Otto came. He helped. He won battles. He protected John. All good, right? Well. John quickly realized that Otto wasn't the type of ally you could control. Otto wanted reforms. Order. Stability. He expected John XII to behave like a proper pope. John did not like that. He began plotting with Otto's enemies and even tried forming secret alliances behind Otto's back. Otto was not amused. The synod that deposed the pope. By 963, Otto had run out of patience. He marched into Rome with his army. John XII fled the city. Otto then called a synod, a formal church meeting, to judge the young pope. This wasn't a fair trial. It was more like a long list of all the things John XII ever did wrong, read aloud by very angry bishops. The accusations were dramatic. Simony, selling church positions. Gambling. Murder. Adultery with multiple women. Turning the palace into a party house. Blinding and mutilating opponents. Invoking pagan gods, again, probably exaggerated. The bishops concluded that John XII was not just a bad pope, he was morally unfit for the role. So they deposed him and elected a new pope, Leo VIII, under Otto's protection. Only problem? John XII wasn't finished yet. Return of the teenage tyrant. When Otto left Rome, John XII stormed back with support from local nobles. He kicked out Leo VIII and reclaimed the papal throne like he was grabbing back his video game controller. His return was chaotic. He punished enemies harshly. Some ex-palace workers were whipped. Others were mutilated. He acted like a young king seeking revenge on everyone who doubted him. But his comeback didn't last long. The scandalous death. John XII died in 964 under circumstances that medieval writers absolutely loved to make dramatic. One chronicler wrote that he died while in bed with a married woman, struck down by her angry husband. Another said he died from a stroke during inappropriate activities. A third said he was killed by a jealous husband who hit him with a hammer. There's no way to know exactly what happened, but everyone agreed on one thing. His death matched his lifestyle, sudden, chaotic, scandalous. He died at around 27 years old. A short life. A wild life. A papacy that felt like a medieval fireworks show. Legacy, how historians judge him. So what do historians make of Pope John XII? Well, not much good. 1. Moral failure. Most historians agree he was a disaster in terms of personal behavior. Even for his era, which wasn't exactly strict about papal morals, John XII stood out. He treated the church like a personal playground and ignored responsibilities completely. 2. Political ineptitude. His decision to call Otto I for help shows he knew politics mattered. But his handling of the alliance was naive. Switching loyalties, plotting against a powerful king, and expecting no consequences? Not the smartest move. He didn't understand the long-term game. He acted like a teenager who couldn't think past next week. 3. Symbol of the Dark Century. John XII became the poster boy for everything wrong with the Saeculum Obscurum. Corruption. Nepotism. Violence. Scandal. Immaturity. Power without discipline. He wasn't the only bad pope of the era, but he was definitely the wildest. 4. Humanized by modern historians. Some modern scholars try to soften his image a bit. They point out he grew up in a violent political world, pressured by family expectations, surrounded by corrupt nobles. He was young, inexperienced, and thrown into the world's most difficult job. But even they admit, yeah, he handled it terribly. Closing thoughts. Pope John XII lived fast, ruled wildly, and died young. His papacy was a storm of parties, political mistakes, and scandals that shocked even the medieval world. He remains one of the most notorious popes in history, not because he changed the church, but because he showed what happens when power meets youth, ego, and zero guidance. John XII's story closes one of the darkest chapters of papal history. And as we tuck this chapter in, we can't help but admit, medieval Rome was chaotic, unpredictable, and full of characters who would have made incredible reality TV. But don't worry, the next chapter takes us deeper into the aftermath, where the church tries to find a way out of the darkness left behind by its teenage tyrant. Pope Benedict IX, the scandalous three-time pope. If you thought the teenage tyrant John XII was wild, allow me to introduce the only man in papal history who treated the papacy like a job he could quit, reclaim, and then quit again. Meet Pope Benedict IX, the scandalous three-time pope, the chaos machine of the 11th century, and a man whose career makes all previous papal drama look like warm-up exercises. His story has it all: political scheming, accusations ranging from bribery to murder, an alleged sale of the papacy, and the kind of personal behavior that made many medieval writers stare at their parchment and say, "No way this is real, but I'll write it anyway." Let's settle in and explore the madness of Benedict IX, one of the most controversial figures to ever wear the papal crown. Who was Benedict IX? Benedict IX was born as Theophylactus of Tusculum, a member of the powerful Tusculani family, which basically ran Rome like a family-owned business. If politics were a medieval board game, the Tusculani had all the good pieces. Thanks to his uncle, Pope John XIX, and even more thanks to his father, Count Alberic III, young Theophylactus didn't have to climb the papal ladder. His family simply placed him on the throne. He became pope around age 20. Some sources say he was even younger, maybe 18, maybe 17. Medieval writers weren't great with birthdays, but they agreed he was very young. So imagine John XII's teenage chaos, but with even more noble family backing and even fewer boundaries. Strap in. The first term, 1032 to 1044, a pope in name, a wildcard in reality. Benedict IX's first papal term was a mix of privilege, scandal, and political mismanagement. Being pope meant nothing to him spiritually, it was simply the highest position his family could give him. And how did he treat that position? Let's just say, not well. Chroniclers accuse him of extravagant parties, Violent behavior. Sexual misconduct. Simony, selling church offices. Nepotism beyond normal medieval standards. Moral degeneracy so bad that even his enemies ran out of adjectives. One writer, Rodulphus Glaber, said Benedict lived a life of such shame that I shudder to write about it. When medieval monks refuse to spill the tea because it's too spicy, you know something serious was happening. Rome grew increasingly tired of Benedict IX's behavior. He wasn't just corrupt, he was incompetent, unpredictable, and dangerous to the city's stability. Eventually, an uprising pushed him out in 1044, ending his first term. But don't worry. He wasn't done yet. The second term, 1045, the brief comeback. After being forced out, Benedict IX did what any self-respecting medieval troublemaker would do, he returned with force. With help from his loyal noble supporters, he reclaimed the papal throne in 1045. But this second term didn't last long, and it wasn't because Benedict suddenly found spiritual discipline. No, the reason was even stranger. Benedict IX wanted to get married. Yes, you read that correctly. The Pope wanted to resign so he could get married. This wasn't allowed under church rules, but when has that ever stopped a dark century Pope? So Benedict IX did the unthinkable. He approached his godfather, Archpriest John Gratian, and basically said, "Hey, want to be Pope? I'll let you have the job, for a price." Gratian, a respected religious man shocked by the corruption around him, decided that paying to stop Benedict's madness might actually help the church. So he handed Benedict IX a large sum of money, and Benedict sold the papacy. This is considered the most infamous act of simony, selling sacred office, in church history. Gratian became Pope Gregory VI, and Benedict IX walked away, pockets full, ready for marriage. But, you guessed it, that wasn't the end. The third term, 1047 to 1048, the final attempt. Selling the papacy didn't solve anything. It only made the political mess worse. Events spiraled when the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III marched into Italy to restore order. He rejected both Benedict IX and Gregory VI as legitimate, but not before Benedict made one last chaotic comeback in 1047, claiming the papacy once again. This third term was short and unstable. Rome was tired of Benedict. The emperor was tired of Benedict. Even Benedict seemed tired of Benedict. Finally, in 1048, his enemies drove him out for good, closing the chapter on the only pope ever to serve 3 non-consecutive terms. The accusations, scandal, crime, and chaos. Benedict IX has one of the darkest reputations of any pope. Let's explore the big allegations, not as proof, but as reflections of how dramatically he shook the church. 1. Simony. Selling church offices? Check. Selling the papacy itself? Also check. 2. Moral degeneracy. Chroniclers claim he lived a wildly immoral lifestyle, with accusations ranging from promiscuity to hosting inappropriate gatherings in the palace. Some writers even accused him of assault and cruelty. 3. Violence and murder. While details are blurry, several sources suggest he was involved in violent acts and possibly murder. Even if exaggerated, the accusations tell us medieval observers saw him as dangerous. 4. Zero spiritual commitment. Benedict treated the papacy like personal property, not a calling. His behavior made the church look like a tool of aristocratic families rather than a moral institution. Even if we allow for exaggeration, because medieval chroniclers love drama, it's clear Benedict IX was deeply corrupt and wildly reckless. The sale of the papacy, a turning point. The moment Benedict IX sold the papacy was more than a scandal. It was a crisis of authority. Think about it, if a pope can resign for cash and hand the keys of St. Peter's to his godfather, what does that say about the church's spiritual legitimacy? This moment spooked everyone: clergy, nobles, emperors, ordinary believers. It made the papacy look cheap and unstable, and it fueled calls for reform. The aftermath even pushed Emperor Henry III to step in, sweep out the corrupt candidates, and appoint a more disciplined pope, Clement II. This was the start of a major shift that would soon lead to the Gregorian reform movement, which tried to clean up church corruption and stop noble families from treating the papacy like a family prize. So ironically, Benedict IX's chaos helped spark real change. Legacy, a scandal that shook the church. Benedict IX left behind a legacy so messy that later historians often talk about him with disbelief. 1. A symbol of corruption. He is regularly listed as one of the worst popes in history. Not because he was incompetent, though he was, but because he embodied everything the church feared becoming. 2. The trigger for reform. His actions helped force the church to rethink its structures. Out of the chaos came change. 3. The three-time pope. He remains the only man to serve 3 separate terms. Not exactly an achievement, but definitely unique. 4. A lesson in misused power. His career is a reminder of how dangerous it is when spiritual authority falls into the hands of someone who neither understands it nor respects it. Closing thoughts. Pope Benedict IX was born into power, handed the papacy before he was ready, and used the office like a personal toy. His 3-term papacy was a storm of scandal, crime, and corruption that shocked medieval Europe and shook the very foundations of the Church. He represents the darkest side of the papacy's medieval struggles, a symbol of how bad things could get when politics ruled faith. And with that, we close the chapter on Benedict IX, the 3-time pope who proved that even the holiest office can be dragged into chaos when the wrong person sits on the throne. Pope Boniface VIII, Power and Pride. If the medieval papacy was a stage, then Pope Boniface VIII stepped onto it wearing the most dramatic costume, holding the biggest script, and announcing, "Everyone, pay attention, I'm in charge now." Boniface VIII ruled from 1294 to 1303, and he didn't do anything halfway. His temper was fierce, his pride legendary, and his ambition so bold that even his supporters sometimes whispered, "Maybe chill a little?" But chilling was not his brand. This chapter walks through his life, his political battles, especially with King Philip IV of France, his sweeping claims to papal authority, his loud reputation, and his dramatic downfall. So settle in and relax as we explore a pope who truly believed the world revolved around the Church, and that he was the Church. The man behind the mitre, ambition and temperament. Boniface VIII was born Benedetto Caetani, into a noble and ambitious Italian family. From the start, he carried himself like someone destined to lead. He wasn't the humble, quiet type. Not at all. People described him as sharp-tongued, confident to the point of arrogance, politically savvy, not afraid to fight for power, firm believer in papal supremacy. If the Church had personality quizzes back then, Boniface would have scored boss level, maximum. He rose through church ranks as a skilled lawyer and negotiator, smart, strategic, and not above getting entangled in political maneuvering. So when Pope Celestine V resigned, or was gently pushed aside, historians still debate, Boniface was ready. He stepped in quickly, decisively, and with the energy of someone who'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. The political landscape, a world of competing kings. The late 120s and early 1300s were a tough time for the papacy. Europe wasn't the loose, scattered place it had been in earlier centuries. Kings were becoming stronger, more centralized, and more confident in ruling without papal approval. And Boniface VIII absolutely hated that idea. He believed the Pope had authority over everyone, kings included. To him, secular rulers were under the Church's umbrella. This wasn't just a theological idea. It was personal. Boniface thought that if the Church didn't assert itself, monarchs would erode its power. So he pushed back hard. And that's when he ran into his biggest rival, King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, a king with a cool nickname and zero interest in bowing to Rome. The clash with King Philip IV, when ego meets ego. Boniface and Philip were like two bulls in the same field, stubborn, proud, and unwilling to step aside. At first, the disputes were about money. Philip needed cash for his wars, so he taxed the French clergy. Boniface said, "You can't tax church people without my permission." Philip ignored him. This annoyed Boniface deeply. So he issued a papal bull, a formal declaration, called Clericis Laicos, forbidding secular rulers from taxing clergy without the Pope's approval. Philip fired back by banning the export of money from France to Rome, basically choking off the Pope's income. Boniface was furious. Philip was furious. And Europe watched the drama unfold like it was the medieval version of a political drama series. The conflict escalated until Boniface issued one of his most famous and bold declarations. Unam Sanctum, the ultimate power statement. In 1302, Boniface VIII released Unam Sanctum, one of the strongest statements of papal supremacy ever written. The key message was basically: there are two powers, spiritual, mine, and temporal, yours. But the spiritual is higher. And all humans, including kings, must submit to the Pope for salvation. This was Boniface VIII saying, "I'm the big boss." End of discussion. Europe reacted with a mix of shock, amusement, and horror. Even some church officials thought he went too far. Philip IV, of course, rejected it completely. Unam Sanctum remains one of the boldest, and most controversial, documents in papal history. If you needed proof of Boniface's pride, ambition, and stubborn spirit, there it is. Reputation. Ruthless, corrupt, and condemned by Dante. Boniface VIII didn't just fight kings. He fought cardinals, Italian families, and anyone who stepped out of line. People accused him of corruption, political bullying, manipulating church offices, using spiritual authority for personal gain. Some claims were exaggerated by enemies. Some were probably true. His reputation got such a dark shine that Dante, in his Divine Comedy, placed Boniface VIII in hell, even though Boniface was still alive when Dante wrote it. Dante absolutely couldn't wait. That's medieval-level shade. Later historians were split. Some saw Boniface as a strong defender of papal rights. Others thought he was a proud, ruthless man who pushed the church into unnecessary conflict. He definitely wasn't boring. The downfall, when the pushback finally hit. Philip IV couldn't stand Boniface's arrogance any longer. So he decided to take the ultimate political step, attack the Pope directly. Philip's advisor, Guillaume de Nogaret, teamed up with Boniface's Italian enemies, especially the Colonna family. In 1303, they organized a force to capture the Pope in his hometown of Anagni. The result was the famous Anagni slap. When soldiers burst into Boniface's quarters, it said that Nogaret or Sciarra Colonna struck the Pope across the face. Whether it was a full slap or just a hit is debated, but the symbolism was massive. A king's agent had laid hands on the Pope. Boniface VIII was shaken but held firm, reportedly shouting, "Here is my neck, here is my head." Basically daring them to kill him. They didn't. Local townspeople freed him after 3 days. But the damage was done. His authority was shattered. His pride wounded. A month later, back in Rome, Boniface died, exhausted, humiliated, and broken. Some said he died of grief. Others said madness. Whatever the cause, his downfall marked a turning point. Legacy, pride, power, and a warning for the Church. How do historians remember Boniface VIII? It depends who you ask. 1. As a man of pride. His ambition was legendary. His stubbornness impressive. His ego gigantic. He believed so strongly in papal power that he pushed harder than almost any pope before him. 2. As a politician who overplayed his hand. Boniface failed to understand that the world was changing. Kings were rising. The Church's dominance was no longer unquestioned. His aggressive claims actually weakened the papacy. 3. As a ruthless leader. Some saw him as corrupt, greedy, and manipulative. His enemies hated him with passion. 4. As a symbol of papal overreach. Unam Sanctum became a symbol of the papacy trying to control everything, and failing. 5. As a turning point. After Boniface's death, the papacy entered the Avignon era, where French influence shaped the Church for decades. His downfall opened the door for secular rulers to challenge Rome more openly. Closing thoughts. Pope Boniface VIII was bold, brilliant, proud, and stubborn. He ruled with a fiery temper and believed deeply in his own authority. But his belief in papal supremacy collided with the rise of powerful kings, and Boniface lost. His story is a reminder that even the strongest leaders can fall when they push too hard. He burned brightly, fought fiercely, and left behind a legacy full of drama, conflict, and cautionary lessons. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still honest, on a pope whose power and pride shaped the final years of medieval papal dominance. Pope Urban VI and the Western Schism. Some popes stumble into trouble. Some walk into it calmly. And then there's Pope Urban VI, who basically sprinted into chaos with open arms, yelling, "Everyone listen to me." Urban VI's papacy didn't just cause problems, it cracked the Church in half and launched the massive crisis we now call the Western Schism, a period when Europe couldn't even agree on who the real pope was. If the medieval Church had a worst timing award, the late 1300s would win easily. This chapter walks you through who Urban VI was, how he got elected, why he exploded at his own cardinals, and how his temper tore the Church into rival camps. All in a chill, simple tone, even though the history is anything but chill. The election that started the schism. Let's set the scene. 1378, Rome. The last French pope, Gregory XI, had just died after moving the papacy back to Rome from Avignon. The people of Rome were terrified the cardinals might elect another French pope and move the papacy right back to France. In medieval Rome, fear did not lead to calm behavior. A mob surrounded the conclave shouting, "Roman Pope! Roman Pope!" The cardinals, not wanting to be torn apart by angry citizens, made a fast, nervous choice. They elected Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari. He wasn't a cardinal. He wasn't famous. But importantly, he wasn't French, and he wasn't tied to any major faction. Perfect, right? Well, not quite. Prignano took the name Urban VI, and within weeks, the cardinals realized they had not elected a calm, balanced leader, they had elected a man whose anger had anger issues. Urban VI, a temper that could scare cardinals. Urban VI's personality was intense. Imagine someone who hates being contradicted, raises his voice during every disagreement, and mixes rage with paranoia. Now give that person ultimate spiritual authority over Europe. According to many sources, Urban VI was easily angered, suspicious of everyone, harsh and unpredictable, embarrassingly rude. He scolded cardinals like a strict teacher yelling at a classroom full of misbehaving kids. He told them they were lazy, corrupt, and greedy. He even yelled at them during meals, ruining perfectly good dinners, with loud lectures about reform. Now, medieval cardinals weren't fragile flowers. They were tough political players. But Urban's behavior was extreme even for them. Some whispered that he wasn't all there mentally. Others said he was blinded by pride. Either way, the cardinals began to regret their decision pretty quickly. The breaking point, cardinals rebel. At first, the cardinals tried to tolerate Urban. Maybe he would calm down. Maybe he would grow into the job. Nope. Urban's temper escalated. He announced reforms no one had agreed to. He publicly humiliated cardinals. He refused to listen to advice. And worst of all, he didn't see anything wrong with his behavior. Eventually, the cardinals fled Rome, regrouped in a safer place, and said, actually, that election might have been invalid. We were chosen under mob pressure. They argued that because the Roman crowd had basically held them hostage, their choice should not count. So in September 1378, the cardinals elected another pope, Robert of Geneva, who became Clement VII. Boom! Now the Church had two popes at the same time. Urban VI in Rome, Clement VII in Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism. Urban VI's fury unleashed. Urban did not react calmly when he learned the cardinals had abandoned him. Instead, he went into full rage mode. He declared the second election invalid, excommunicated everyone involved, and doubled down on every trait that had caused the problem in the first place. He surrounded himself with loyalists, tightened his control, and started running the papacy like a fortress under attack. Anyone who disagreed with him became a target. Cardinals who went over to Clement VII were labeled traitors. Cardinals who stayed with Urban were treated not much better. Urban VI's government quickly became a mixture of fear and suspicion. Torture, imprisonment, and violent reprisals. Urban VI's paranoia eventually led him to take terrifying actions. He suspected everyone of disloyalty, including the cardinals who had stayed with him. In 1385, he accused a group of these cardinals of plotting against him. The evidence was shaky at best, but Urban didn't wait for clarity. He ordered their arrest. What followed was some of the darkest behavior ever recorded for any pope. Some cardinals were tortured. Others were imprisoned in harsh conditions. Several died under torture or simply disappeared. Urban reportedly watched some of the torture sessions personally. That's not exactly the vibe you want from a spiritual leader. This event shocked Europe. Even many who supported Urban politically were horrified. But because the schism had split Europe into rival factions, there was no easy way to remove him. Urban VI stayed in power for years, ruling with anger, suspicion, and brutal punishments. Consequences: a church divided. The Western Schism wasn't just a disagreement. It was a crisis that tore Europe apart. Here's how the split unfolded. Urban VI's side: Rome, England, most of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, Northern Europe. Clement VI's side: Avignon, France, Scotland, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Naples. Each king supported whichever pope gave them better political advantages. Suddenly, the Catholic world, supposed to be united under one shepherd, had two popes calling each other false, corrupt, and illegitimate. And if two weren't enough, at some points later in the crisis, there were three. Urban VI didn't start the schism intentionally, but his personality made it almost impossible to heal. Every move he made deepened the divide. Even after he died in 1389, the schism continued for decades, ending only in 1417 at the Council of Constance. Long-term damage: a reputation in ruins. Urban VI's reign left scars on the papacy. 1. Loss of moral authority. People saw the Pope acting like a violent tyrant. Not great for the Church's image. 2. Distrust in papal elections. If an election could be overturned, or produce two popes, how legitimate was the whole system? 3. Deep political divisions. Countries were forced to choose sides, making religion feel like politics rather than faith. 4. A crisis of faith. Ordinary Christians wondered. How can we trust the Church when even the popes don't agree who the Pope is? Urban didn't create every problem of the era, but his unstable behavior and brutal actions poured gasoline on an already smoking fire. Closing thoughts. Pope Urban VI was not a villain in a simple sense. He believed he was defending the Church. He believed he was right. But his temper, paranoia, and violent leadership caused one of the worst splits in Church history. He stands as a reminder that character matters, especially for leaders with enormous power. One man's insecurity can shake an institution. One man's anger can divide a continent. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, but fully aware that medieval church politics were wild, dramatic, and full of lessons about how not to run things. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. Nepotism, murder, and scandal. If the papacy had a most infamous pope contest, Pope Alexander VI would probably take the crown, wave at the crowd, and then quietly ask how much money he gets for winning. Born Rodrigo Borgia, he became one of the most controversial figures in church history, famous not for holiness, but for ambition, power moves, scandal, and a family that could have starred in its own medieval soap opera. This chapter walks through who he was, how he rose to power, the shocking rumors that surrounded him, his legendary nepotism, and the lasting stain he left on the image of the papacy. Get comfy, this pope's story has everything. Who was Rodrigo Borgia? Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 to a powerful Spanish-Italian clan that already had deep roots in church politics. His uncle, Alfonso Borgia, became Pope Calixtus III and gave young Rodrigo an early boost in the church. Rodrigo became a cardinal at 25 and was known for charm, sharp political skills, massive wealth, lifestyle that didn't exactly match priestly expectations. He wasn't the type to sit quietly in a monastery. He lived big, dressed well, and made connections everywhere. The Borgias were ambitious, dramatic, and determined to rise, and Rodrigo was the boldest of them all. By the time the 1492 papal conclave arrived, Rodrigo was one of the most powerful cardinals in Rome. And according to many sources, he was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to become pope. How he allegedly bought the papacy. The 1492 papal election was intense. Power, influence, money, it was all in play. And this is where the simony allegations come in. Many historians believe Rodrigo practically purchased the papacy through bribes to influential cardinals, promises of titles and lands, strategic favors. Was it proven in a modern legal sense? No. Did almost everyone in Rome believe it? Yes. One cardinal said the election looked less like a spiritual process and more like an auction. Another claimed that Rodrigo delivered fine horses, money, and property in exchange for votes. Whether exaggerated or not, the accusations fit Rodrigo's style. And so, he emerged victorious and took the name Pope Alexander VI. From the start, people whispered that his crown came with a price tag, and that set the tone for everything that followed. Nepotism at full power, the Borgia family takeover. Once on the throne, Alexander VI wasted no time promoting his family. If nepotism were a sport, he'd be the world champion. Cesare Borgia. His most famous son, Cesare, was brilliant, ruthless, and ambitious, basically the medieval version of a main villain with great hair. Alexander made him a cardinal at first, then later let him abandon church life and become a military commander. Cesari's campaigns in central Italy shaped politics for years. Lucrezia Borgia. Alexander's daughter, Lucrezia, became a key political tool. Through her marriages, the Borgias formed alliances with powerful families. Rumors painted her as dangerously seductive, but most of that was propaganda from enemies. The Borgia clan strategy. Alexander placed relatives everywhere. Governorships, church offices, landed estates, military commands. It wasn't subtle. Rome knew exactly what was happening. This was a family takeover, plain and simple. Alexander didn't even pretend otherwise. In his eyes, strengthening the Borgia dynasty was part of strengthening the church, or at least that's how he justified it. Moral scandal, rumors, affairs, and children. Alexander VI's private life was, let's say, energetic. Unlike most popes, he didn't hide his relationships. Before becoming pope, he had multiple children with Venanza de Catania, one of his longtime partners. After becoming pope, he publicly favored another woman, Giulia Farnese, who was rumored to be his mistress. These relationships, and the children that came from them, became fuel for gossip. Enemies of the Borgias wrote stories claiming Alexander lived a life of corruption, extravagance, parties, affairs, general moral chaos. Some rumors were clearly exaggerated. But others had enough truth that even friendly observers raised an eyebrow. The murder accusations. Here things get darker. Some sources claim the Borgias used poison to remove political enemies. Did Alexander personally murder anyone? Hard to say. Did people around him die mysteriously? Yes. A surprising number, actually. One famous case involved his son Juan Borgia, who was murdered under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered the killer was another Borgia, possibly Cesare. But nothing was proven. In any case, the Borgia family's reputation became tied to violence, intrigue, and scandal. Whether fair or not, the stories spread everywhere. Alexander VI's political rule. Alexander wasn't just a scandal magnate. He was also an effective ruler, if your definition of effective includes ruthless and strategically brilliant. He rebuilt finances, navigated wars, and strengthened papal territories. He supported artists, reshaped Rome's streets, and welcomed explorers like Christopher Columbus, whom he blessed after his voyages. But everything he did was overshadowed by his private life and family agenda. His political decisions often benefited the Borgias first, and the church second. Even allies weren't safe if they stood in the way of Borgia plans. The Borgia brand, corruption personified. By the late 1490s, the name Borgia had become synonymous with corruption. There were jokes that you had to count your fingers after shaking hands with them. Whether accurate or not, the Borgias became the villains of European gossip. Enemies spread stories. Italian families like the Orsini and Colonna despised them. French and Spanish writers passed along scandal after scandal. Even churchmen joined in. Alexander VI became the symbol of everything reformers wanted to fix. Dante would have hated him. Thankfully, Dante wrote the Divine Comedy before Alexander's time, otherwise the man would definitely have ended up in the Inferno with a special VIP seat. Rome's view. Some Romans liked Alexander's energy. Others thought he was turning the papacy into a family business. Most just held on to their wallets and hoped not to get poisoned. The death of Alexander VI. In 1503, Alexander VI died suddenly. Rumors immediately spread that he had been poisoned, either by enemies or by accident. Most historians today think he died of malaria or fever. But because he was a Borgia, poison was the version people preferred. Cesare Borgia, recovering from the same illness, was too weak to secure the next papal election. The Borgia dynasty collapsed almost overnight. Just like that, the most dramatic family in papal history slipped out of power. Legacy, a name forever linked to corruption. What did Alexander VI leave behind? 1. A damaged papal reputation. His scandals helped spark the early calls for reform that eventually led to the Protestant Reformation. 2. The Borgia legend. For centuries, Borgia meant corruption, ambition, and treachery, even in fiction. 3. A warning about nepotism. His extreme family favoritism became the "what not to do" example for the next generation of popes. 4. A complicated historical record. Some modern historians argue he wasn't as evil as legend claims, just extremely political in a corrupt age. But even they admit he left a stain on the office. Closing thoughts. Pope Alexander VI was bold, ambitious, scandalous, and impossible to ignore. Whether villain, mastermind, or misunderstood operator, he reshaped the papacy, and not in a good way. His life shows how far the Church could fall when politics and power mattered more than spiritual leadership. The Borgia era was a storm, and Alexander VI was right at the center of it. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still honest, on the Pope whose name became a global symbol for corruption, ambition, and the wildest scandals of Renaissance Rome. Pope Sixtus IV, Conspiracy and Corruption. If Renaissance popes had a double life award, Pope Sixtus IV would win it with a smile. On one hand, he gave the world the Sistine Chapel, boosted artists, and left behind some of the most stunning architecture in Rome. On the other hand, well, he also plunged deep into political scheming, nepotism, and one of the most famous assassination plots in Italian history. Sixtus IV ruled from 1471 to 1484, a time when Italian politics felt like a giant chess game where everyone cheated and nobody apologized. He was smart, ambitious, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. This chapter walks you through his bright public side, and his darker, conspiratorial one, with our usual chill tone. Who was Sixtus IV? A Renaissance pope with Renaissance problems. Born Francesco della Rovere, Sixtus IV came from a humble family in northern Italy. He became a respected Franciscan theologian, known for his intelligence and discipline. When he was elected pope, many thought he'd bring spiritual renewal. Spoiler, he did not. But he did bring energy. Sixtus IV was a classic Renaissance pope, part religious leader, part political ruler, part art patron, part Italian uncle who knows a guy who knows a guy. He loved learning, architecture, and prestige. Under him, Rome became more beautiful. But behind those bright creations, there were shadows, deep ones. The Nepotism Olympics, Sixtus IV's family promotions. Sixtus IV didn't invent nepotism, but he definitely perfected it. The Della Rovere and Riario families, his extended clan, got more promotions than a highly caffeinated CEO's relatives. In the Renaissance, nephew usually meant this young man is politically useful. Sixtus IV took this literally. He appointed 16 cardinals, many of whom were his nephews. Some were talented. Some, not so much. His most famous relatives include Giuliano della Rovere. Later became Pope Julius II, the famous, warrior pope. Julius was tough, short-tempered, and ironically even more dramatic than his uncle. Pietro Riario. A flashy cardinal known for hosting wild banquets and burning through money like it grew on trees. Girolamo Riario. Sixtus's favorite nephew and the key figure in the conspiracy we'll dive into soon. Sixtus used his papal wealth and influence to set his nephews up with territories, titles, and riches. The papacy started looking less like a spiritual office and more like a family business. This wasn't unusual for Renaissance politics, but Sixtus did it on a whole new level. The Puzzi conspiracy, murder in the cathedral. Now we get to the juicy part. Italy at this time wasn't a unified country, it was a collection of rival city-states constantly plotting against each other. And the city of Florence, run by the powerful Medici family, was one of the brightest, richest, and most annoying to its enemies. Sixtus IV did not like Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He thought Lorenzo had too much power. Worse, Lorenzo blocked one of Sixtus's nephews from getting political control in Florence. You could say bad blood was building. Sixtus wanted more influence in Florence, and the Medici family stood in his way. So, an alliance formed. Girolamo Riario, the Pope's nephew. The Puzzi family, Medici rivals. Francesco Salviati, Archbishop of Pisa. And, indirectly, Sixtus IV, who gave support but later claimed innocence. Together, they carried out the Puzzi conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Mass inside Florence's cathedral. Yes. A murder plot inside a church. Very holy behavior. The attack. On April 26, 1478, during High Mass in the Florence Cathedral, the conspirators struck. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed to death. Lorenzo was wounded but managed to escape. The plot failed to fully kill off the Medici power, and Florence erupted in anger. What followed wasn't pretty. Conspirators were hunted down, hanged, dragged through the streets, or executed publicly. Florence sent a message: don't cross the Medici. Did Sixtus IV approve the assassination? Here's the big question: how involved was the Pope? Historians agree on this much. Sixtus backed the political goals of the conspirators. He approved plans to weaken the Medici. He allowed his nephew Girolamo to scheme freely. He gave Archbishop Salviati suspicious authority. Did he explicitly say, "Go kill the Medici brothers"? Probably not in those exact words. But did he create the conditions, the alliances, and the political pressure that led to the attack? Yes. Very much so. When the conspiracy blew up, Sixtus IV didn't respond with apologies. Instead, he excommunicated Lorenzo de' Medici and placed Florence under interdict. This only made things worse. The Pope versus Florence feud became a small war. So while Sixtus dodged direct orders for murder, his fingerprints were all over the conspiracy. Financial corruption, the expensive papacy. Sixtus IV had a lot of taste. Expensive taste. He built churches, repaired aqueducts, beautified Rome, and poured money into massive architectural projects. The Sistine Chapel, named after him, was only one of his achievements. But Renaissance art wasn't cheap. To raise money, Sixtus IV sold church offices, raised taxes, granted favors in exchange for payments, gave out questionable, spiritual privileges to wealthy patrons, supported military campaigns that soaked up mountains of gold. Some historians even claim that Rome under Sixtus became a giant marketplace where everything, from church jobs to political favors, could be bought. It was corruption mixed with creative financing. A very Renaissance combination. Political maneuvering, a pope in the Game of Thrones. Sixtus IV loved Italian politics almost as much as he loved his nephews. And he wasn't shy about jumping into battles between states. He fought with Florence. He battled with Venice. He negotiated with Naples. He schemed with Milan. He alternated between alliances like a man changing hats. He saw himself not just as the spiritual father of Europe but as a strategic ruler who could reshape Italy. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he caused a mess. Many popes played politics, but Sixtus often played at a dangerous level, mixing church authority with outright aggression. The darker side of his legacy. While Sixtus IV's achievements in art and infrastructure are undeniable, his darker side has stayed with history. 1. Nepotism gone wild. His extreme favoritism fed the growing frustration across Europe about papal corruption. 2. The Puzzi conspiracy scandal. Even if he didn't plan the murder directly, his involvement stained the papacy. 3. Financial misuse. Selling offices and collecting fees for everything weakened the spiritual reputation of the Church. 4. Political chaos. His constant involvement in Italian wars and conspiracies made the papacy seem more like a political club than a holy institution. These problems didn't disappear with his death, they helped build the dissatisfaction that later exploded into the Protestant Reformation. Closing thoughts. Pope Sixtus IV was a complicated figure, a Renaissance visionary who funded artists, expanded Rome, and left behind breathtaking architecture, but also a political operator who used church power for family advantage, backed conspiracies, and fed corruption. He shows how the Renaissance papacy walked a fine line between shining culture and deep moral compromise. Sixtus was brilliant, ambitious, and bold, but also willing to bend rules, break alliances, and throw the church into scandal for political gain. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still honest, on the Pope who blended beauty and corruption in a way only the Renaissance could produce. Pope Leo X, the Indulgence Pope and the Reformation spark. If the Renaissance papacy had a Most Fabulous Lifestyle award, Pope Leo X would win without even trying. Born Giovanni de' Medici, he came from the richest banking family in Italy, grew up surrounded by art, luxury, and power, and carried that same glamorous energy straight into the Vatican. Leo X wasn't the kind of pope who sat quietly reading philosophy or fasting in a tiny room. No, he threw grand ceremonies, loved pageantry, adored music, kept artists busy, and spent money like it was constantly replenishing itself by magic. Spoiler, it wasn't. But Leo acted like being pope meant having a bottomless wallet. This chapter takes you through his personality, his extravagant spending, the financial problems he created, the infamous indulgence sales, and how all of this, without him meaning to, helped spark the Protestant Reformation. Meet Leo X, the Medici prince who became pope. Giovanni de' Medici grew up in Florence, the glittering capital of Renaissance creativity. His family controlled banks, politics, and culture. They practically owned half the city and influenced the other half. Giovanni learned early how power worked, and how comfortable life could be when your family is mega-rich. He was made a cardinal at just 13 years old. Yes, barely a teenager, already wearing red robes. The Medici family could make things happen. By the time he became pope in 1513, Giovanni, now Leo X, had fully embraced refinement, elegance, and enjoyment of life. He wasn't cruel or violent like some notorious popes. He wasn't scheming 24/7 like a Borgia. Instead, he was cheerful, charming, artistic, and very, very expensive. One of his famous quotes sums him up perfectly. "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." He wasn't joking. Spending like a Renaissance king. Leo X loved a show. He turned papal ceremonies into massive theatrical events complete with musicians, sculptures, extravagant decorations, and crowds of attendees. He lived in luxury, fine clothing, huge banquets, exotic pets, and lavish festivals. He even revived classical-style triumphal processions, as if he were a Roman emperor. He invested heavily in art and architecture. And to be fair, he supported some incredible projects. Raphael's work in the Vatican. New buildings in Rome. Funding for poets, scholars, musicians. Support for education. Strengthening the Vatican Library. Leo X truly believed art and culture were essential, almost part of the Church's mission. And honestly, Renaissance Rome is gorgeous today partly because of him. But beauty comes at a price. Within a few years of his papacy, Leo had drained the treasury. The Vatican went from wealthy, thanks to earlier popes, to struggling. The Medici style of spending didn't work well when the bank account belonged to the Church, not to Florence. And so, Leo had to find money fast. Financial pressure equals creative fundraising. To refill the Vatican's empty purse, Leo used both traditional tools and new ones. Some were reasonable. Some were questionable. And some were flat-out disastrous. One of the major projects needing money was the ongoing construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Started under earlier popes, it was shaping up to be one of the largest and most expensive churches ever built. Leo wasn't going to let that project slow down. So he approved the widespread sale of indulgences, a move that would change the course of European history. Indulgences, the spark that lit the Reformation. Let's keep this simple. An indulgence was a remission of penalties for sins. In theory, it encouraged people to repent and do good works. In reality, by Leo's time, indulgences had become so commercialized that many people saw them as tickets to forgiveness. Leo X didn't invent indulgences. But he took their marketing to a whole new level. To raise money for St. Peter's, he authorized the selling of indulgences across the Holy Roman Empire, with flashy sermons and dramatic promises. One of the most famous sellers was Johann Tetzel, who supposedly advertised, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Whether Tetzel actually said that word for word is debated, but the message was clear: give money, and you get heavenly benefits. This hit a nerve. Many ordinary Christians felt uncomfortable. Many scholars felt outraged. And one monk in particular, Martin Luther, was about to transform his frustration into a movement. Enter Martin Luther, Leo's most unwanted critic. Luther, a German Augustinian monk and professor, disliked indulgence abuse intensely. He believed forgiveness couldn't be bought and that the church needed deep reform. In 1517, he wrote the famous 95 Theses, attacking indulgence sales and questioning papal financial practices. He sent the document to his archbishop and, according to legend, nailed a copy to the church door in Wittenberg. Leo X didn't take Luther seriously at first. To him, Luther was just another quarrelsome monk. He even joked that Luther's protest was like a drunken German rant that would soon fade. Oops. Instead of fading, Luther's ideas spread like wildfire, thanks to the printing press, frustrated peasants, annoyed nobles, and Europe's growing hunger for change. Leo tried to stop him. He demanded Luther recant. He threatened him with excommunication. He issued papal bulls condemning Luther's ideas. But by the time Leo realized the seriousness of the situation, the Reformation had begun. His attempt to silence Luther only fueled the movement. Leo X excommunicated Luther in 1521. But it didn't matter. The break from Rome was already underway. The paradox of Leo X, patron of culture, catalyst of chaos. Leo's papacy is one giant paradox, fascinating and tragic at the same time. He loved culture. He adored the arts, valued learning, beautified Rome, supported libraries and universities, and surrounded himself with thinkers and creators. He brought Renaissance culture into full bloom. But his spending wrecked the church's finances. His extravagant lifestyle and artistic investments drained the treasury faster than he could refill it. He encouraged art but ignored growing anger. While Europe's middle and lower classes struggled with taxes and corruption, Leo focused on festivals and architecture. He triggered the Reformation without meaning to. He didn't hate theology. He didn't try to start a crisis. But his actions, especially indulgence sales, gave reformers the perfect target. He saw himself as a Renaissance prince, not a spiritual reformer. Leo X wasn't evil, just out of touch. He believed the church was stable and powerful, not realizing pressure was building from every direction. The result? One of the biggest religious revolutions in history. Leo X's legacy, beauty and trouble. Leo died in 1521, at age 45, after eating too much food at an evening feast. Some say he died from illness. Others say exhaustion. But many joked he spent himself to death. His legacy is a mix of brilliance and catastrophe. He enriched the arts. He left Rome stunning. He deepened corruption. He strained the treasury. He pushed reformers into open rebellion. His policies helped fracture Western Christianity. One historian summed him up well. Leo X brought the Renaissance to Rome, and the Reformation to Europe. Not a small achievement, even if he did it accidentally. Closing thoughts. Pope Leo X lived like a prince, ruled like an artist, and responded to crisis like someone who thought the storm would pass on its own. His indulgence policies, spending habits, and misreading of public anger helped ignite the Protestant Reformation. He wasn't the worst pope, but he might have been one of the least aware of the world changing around him. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still clear, on the Pope whose love of beauty sparked one of the greatest religious revolutions of all time. Pope Clement VII, politicking to disaster. Some popes are remembered as saints. Some as scholars. And then there's Pope Clement VII, who is mostly remembered as the guy whose political decisions helped lead to the sack of Rome, one of the worst disasters in papal history. Not exactly the resume he hoped for. Born Giulio de' Medici, Clement VII came from the same famous family as Leo X. But while Leo lived with flair and fun, Clement ruled with hesitation, caution, and a talent for picking the wrong allies at the wrong time. He wasn't evil. He wasn't wild. He was simply a cautious, clever politician in a world where caution and cleverness didn't help much. So sit back and relax as we stroll through a papacy filled with alliances, betrayals, bad timing, and a final catastrophe that shook Rome to its core. Who was Clement VII? A Medici with a tough job. Giulio de' Medici was born into power, but also into scandal. He was an illegitimate child of the Medici line, though that didn't stop him from rising through the church ranks. He was smart, calm, diplomatic, and deeply political. Basically, he was the opposite of Leo X's party-loving personality. By the time he became pope in 1523, Europe was a dangerous playground full of giant rival powers. The Holy Roman Empire under Charles V. The French kingdom under Francis I. The English kingdom under Henry VIII. And Italian states that switched alliances like outfits. Clement VII thought he could maneuver between all these rulers like a master chess player. But instead of playing chess, it turned into a messy game of political Jenga. And eventually, the entire tower fell. Clement's diplomacy, trying to balance everyone. Clement VII believed the papacy should act as a neutral referee among Europe's rival kingdoms. Great idea in theory, except none of those kingdoms wanted a referee. They wanted a pope who sided with them. Clement tried to stay balanced. He negotiated with France. He negotiated with the Holy Roman Empire. He made deals with England. He tried keeping Italian states calm. But instead of keeping everyone happy, he managed to irritate everyone at different moments. He would promise one side support, then quietly promise the same to their enemies. This worked for a little while, but eventually the kings compared notes, and they weren't happy. The big problem: France versus the Holy Roman Empire. The main rivalry Clement VII had to navigate was the deadly feud between Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and also King of Spain. These two rulers fought like it was a sport. At first, Clement leaned gently toward France. He liked the French cultural world and wanted to reduce Charles V's influence in Italy. But then France lost the Battle of Pavia in 1525. Francis I was captured by Charles V's troops and dragged to Spain like a trophy. Suddenly Charles was insanely powerful. Clement panicked. If the emperor controlled all of Italy, the papacy would basically become his puppet. So Clement switched sides. He helped form the League of Cognac, an alliance including France, Venice, Florence, and Milan, all united against Charles V. This was bold. Also, not very smart. The emperor's revenge marched toward Rome. Charles V felt betrayed. Really betrayed. Clement had been friendly with him, and then suddenly Clement turned on him, funded an anti-imperial alliance, and tried to weaken him across Italy. So Charles V let loose an army made up of Spanish infantry, German mercenaries, Lutheran soldiers who really disliked the Pope, soldiers who hadn't been paid in months and were very, very angry. Not exactly the kind of group you want walking toward your city. This massive force marched south, barely controlled by their commanders. Clement underestimated their desperation and the emperor's rage. By early 1527, things looked bad. And then they looked worse. The sack of Rome, 1527, the worst day of his papacy. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army reached Rome. The city had weak defenses, little preparation, and an unlucky streak longer than a bad poker night. The troops stormed in. What followed was one of the most brutal events in Renaissance Italy. Churches looted. Priests killed. Noble families robbed. Art destroyed. Disease spreading. Chaos everywhere. Rome fell into violence and misery for months. It wasn't a small attack, it was a catastrophe. Even hardened soldiers wrote that the destruction shocked them. And where was Clement VII? Hiding. He took refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress connected to the Vatican by a secret elevated passageway called the Passetto di Borgo. He stayed there trapped for almost 7 months, watching Rome burn while negotiating for his own survival. Eventually, he escaped by making humiliating concessions to Charles V. For Rome, it was trauma. For the Church, it was humiliation. And for Clement VII, it was the disaster that defined his entire papacy. Why did this happen? Clement's weakness and political missteps. Historians don't think Clement was evil. They think he was cautious, indecisive, and too political for the moment he lived in. His main problems. 1. Trying to please everyone. Instead of choosing a strong alliance, he kept switching sides. 2. Underestimating Charles V. The emperor had enormous power. Clement treated him like just another rival king. 3. Overestimating France. Francis I was charismatic, but his military record was inconsistent. 4. Thinking politics mattered more than stability. Clement feared losing influence in Italy more than he feared an angry imperial army. 5. Slow decision-making. He wasn't bold like Julius II or polished like Leo X. He hesitated. A lot. In fairness, the world was changing fast. The Reformation was spreading. Europe was shifting. But Clement's choices made everything harder. His failings, ambition over stability. At the heart of Clement's problems was a simple truth: he cared more about political control than spiritual leadership. He focused on balance of power, Italian alliances, Medici influence in Florence, diplomatic games, territorial control. Meanwhile, spiritual issues, including the growing Reformation, were neglected. Luther's movement expanded dramatically during his papacy, and Clement reacted slowly and inconsistently. He didn't understand the scale of the crisis. He treated it like another political puzzle, and it wasn't. Legacy: a papacy remembered for disaster. Clement VII's legacy is not flattering. He isn't listed among the worst popes, but he is listed among the most unfortunate and politically disastrous. 1. The sack of Rome. This alone marked his reign as a failure in leadership and protection. 2. Weak diplomacy. His constant shifting of alliances is often seen as the main trigger for the catastrophe. 3. Medici obsession. He returned the Medici family to power in Florence, but it cost him political stability elsewhere. 4. Failure to address the Reformation. He let the movement grow unchecked, deepening the eventual split. 5. A reputation for political disaster, not spiritual guidance. Clement wasn't known for doctrine, reform, or inspiration. He was known for surviving his own bad decisions. Closing thoughts. Pope Clement VII wasn't wicked or wild. He was simply a cautious politician stuck in a dangerous world, making nervous choices at the worst possible moments. His attempt to balance Europe's great powers ended in disaster, leaving Rome scarred and the papacy humiliated. His story is a reminder that sometimes the biggest failures come not from malice, but from hesitation, misjudgment, and the belief that diplomacy can solve everything, even when the world is on fire. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still honest, on the Pope whose political miscalculations helped throw Rome into one of its darkest days. By now, you've met quite a few of the Church's most chaotic popes, men who turned the papacy into a battlefield, a family business, a party venue, or a political casino. But the bad pope lineup doesn't end with our main cast. The history of the papacy stretches over 2,000 years, and sprinkled throughout are other popes whose actions, attitudes, or ambitions earned them questionable reputations. This chapter takes a chill walk through some of those additional figures. Not to roast them for fun, okay, maybe a tiny bit, but to show that corruption, violence, and moral failure weren't just isolated accidents. They were built into the world the popes lived in. And sometimes the bad pope of a given era wasn't even uniquely awful, just operating inside a system that encouraged vice. Let's dive in. Innocent III, brilliant, powerful, and responsible for the Inquisition. Calling Pope Innocent III a bad pope is controversial, because many historians rank him as one of the most effective popes in history. But if we're talking about severity, ambition, and actions that had grim consequences, he deserves a spot on this list. Innocent III ruled from 1198 to 1216 and basically reshaped the medieval church. He strengthened papal authority, launched crusades, and inserted the papacy into the politics of every major kingdom in Europe. But he also laid the groundwork for the Inquisition, supported the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars, which turned into a brutal massacre, interfered heavily in secular rule, asserted papal supremacy in ways that made earlier popes look modest. He wasn't corrupt in the parties and bribes sense. His scandals were more on the religious violence and power consolidation side. Innocent III is a reminder that a pope can be both brilliant and terrifying. Pope Paul II, the Renaissance collector of everything. Paul II ruled from 1464 to 1471, and he is often remembered as a man who loved luxury a little too much for someone in holy office. He had a passion for jewels, fine clothing, lavish processions, endless collections of ancient coins, statues, and curiosities. If Paul II lived today, he'd probably run an antiques Instagram account and show up to events in the sparkliest outfit in the room. He also clashed with humanists and scholars, showing a strict and sometimes petty streak. Some accused him of heavy-handed censorship. Others said he wasted church money on his personal fashion goals. He wasn't violent like some earlier popes, but his priorities were skewed. Paul II is a great example of how Renaissance popes could drift from spiritual life into Renaissance celebrity mode. Julius II, the warrior pope. Now here's a pope who didn't just wear armor metaphorically, he literally marched in it. Pope Julius II, 1503 to 1513, was a storm of muscle, money, and military ambition. Nicknamed the warrior pope, Julius II led armies into battle, captured cities, formed political alliances and broke them just as quickly, pushed France out of Italy, strengthened the papal states through force. He was tough, fiery, and famously grumpy. One ambassador said Julius II spoke like a soldier, not a priest. Another reported that the pope would sometimes curse in frustration, very Renaissance, very human. But Julius also commissioned Michelangelo, Raphael, and the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. He gave Rome some of its greatest masterpieces while also acting like a medieval general. His reign shows that papal corruption didn't always take the form of personal sin, sometimes it took the form of raw aggression and political appetite. Honorius III, Alexander VIII, and others, middle-level misbehaviors. Not every bad pope is headline material. Some popes quietly contributed to corruption through smaller acts of simony, nepotism, and bad judgment. For example, Honorius III. Not personally corrupt, but failed to control the chaos of his time, letting opportunists misuse their offices. Alexander VIII handed out roles to relatives like candy, continuing the centuries-old tradition of papal nepotism. Urban VIII heavily favored his Barberini family and drained papal finances to support their luxurious lifestyles. These popes weren't infamous like the Borgias or explosive like Julius II. But they helped maintain the environment that made corruption feel normal in Rome. The systemic problem: why so many bad popes? By now, it's easy to think, wow, the church must have had terrible hiring practices. But the deeper issue wasn't individual personalities, it was the system. For much of history, the papacy was a political throne, a wealthy estate, a military power, a giant employer, a diplomatic agency, a bank, a cultural patron, a target for ambitious noble families. That meant a pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was also a king, mayor, general, treasurer, judge, and CEO. And when you put that much worldly power into one office, three things happen. 1. Ambitious men fight to control it. This attracted people with political goals, not spiritual ones. 2. Families use it for personal gain. Nepotism wasn't a flaw, it was a strategy. Promoting nephews meant building a political base. 3. Corruption becomes easy. Land, money, church offices, everything could be traded. The problem wasn't just bad popes. It was a system that rewarded ambition, protected vice, and blurred the line between church and state. Were these popes purely evil? Or just products of their time? Here's where we take a breath and look at things with nuance. It's easy to judge past popes by modern standards. But medieval and Renaissance Europe were rough places, filled with war, shifting alliances, and social pressures we can barely imagine now. Many bad popes weren't born as villains. They were shaped by the politics around them, the demands of survival, the expectations of powerful families, the constant pressure to defend church territory, a culture where bribery or military force were everyday tools. Some popes genuinely believed they were protecting the church, even when they used violence or corruption to do it. Others were carried along by systems they didn't fully control. So while many popes made disastrous or immoral choices, they weren't always outliers, they were products of a dysfunctional system trying to hold itself together. The tension between morality and survival. This brings us to a key theme of church history. The constant clash between personal virtue and institutional survival. A pope might want to be holy and humble. But if he was too gentle, rival families or kingdoms could crush him. A pope might want peace. But without armies or alliances, he couldn't defend the papal states. A pope might want reform. But entrenched families resisted every change. Often, popes who acted well spiritually failed politically. And popes who acted well politically failed morally. This tension produced some incredible spiritual leaders. And some of history's most notorious figures. Closing thoughts. Chapter 14 reminds us that the story of bad popes is bigger than just a few dramatic personalities. It's a long pattern shaped by power, politics, family networks, and the dangerous world of medieval and Renaissance Europe. Some popes were corrupt. Some were violent. Some were self-indulgent. Others were flawed men doing the best they could in a system that rewarded all the wrong things. But together, they show the complexity of the papacy, an institution that struggled for centuries to balance holiness with survival. And with that, we close this chapter, still chill, still honest, on the wider cast of popes whose actions added layers of drama, danger, and depth to the history of the Church. We've reached the end of our long, wild tour through the darkest corners of papal history. From teenage tyrants to warrior popes, from schemers to spenders, from corrupt families to outright disasters, you've seen a whole cast of characters who definitely weren't in the brochure for holy leadership. But now it's time to slow down, take a breath, and ask. What does history actually teach us from all this chaos? Because these stories aren't just medieval drama. They're mirrors, reflections of how humans behave when they get power, pressure, fear, or too much freedom and not enough accountability. And even though the world today looks very different from the 10th century, the lessons still apply. Let's explore the big takeaways, the reforms, the cultural legacy, and the final thoughts that tie this whole series together. What the worst popes teach us about power and humanity. After 14 chapters of scandal, it's easy to think the message is, wow, some popes were terrible. And sure, many were. But the deeper point is this. Give humans enough power with little oversight, and things get messy. Give them sacred authority, and things get even messier. The papacy mixed spiritual authority, forgiveness, salvation, ritual, with political power, land, armies, money. That combination is like giving someone a sword in one hand and a halo in the other and saying, "You'll figure it out." Throughout history we saw ambition turning into domination. Spiritual roles turned into political tools. Families grabbing the papacy like a throne. Leaders losing themselves in pleasure, money, or paranoia. Reformers rising only after things fell apart. These aren't just bad pope stories. They're human stories, the same dangers you'd find anywhere power gathers. The popes who struggled the most weren't always evil. Some were overwhelmed. Some were shaped by their era. Some were good people who made catastrophically bad choices. And some were straight-up disasters from the start. Together, they show us that power doesn't magically make someone holy. It only magnifies whatever was already inside them. Reform, how the Church tried to clean itself up. The good news is that the papacy didn't stay in the mud forever. For every corrupt leader, there were reformers who said, "Okay, enough." The Church responded to scandals with reforms, sometimes too late, sometimes imperfectly, but still genuinely. Here are some of the big changes. 1. Church councils. Major gatherings like the Lateran Councils and the Council of Constance tried to tackle simony, nepotism, multiple popes, and political chaos. Council of Constance, 1414–1418, even ended the Western Schism by forcing all rival popes to step aside and starting fresh. 2. Election reforms. To stop families from rigging papal elections, new rules were created. Cardinals locked in conclave. Strict secrecy. Limits on outside influence. No armed mobs waiting outside, looking at you. Urban VI's election. These changes didn't fix everything, but they made bribery and manipulation harder. 3. Moral reform movements. Inside the Church, monastic orders pushed for discipline and poverty. Later, after Leo X and the Indulgence Crisis, the Catholic Reformation, sometimes called the Counter-Reformation, brought Jesuit teaching, better priest training, stricter rules, cleaner finances, new spiritual energy. These reforms were partly damage control, but also sincere attempts to restore credibility. 4. Legal and administrative overhaul. Popes eventually stopped handing out bishoprics like birthday gifts. Nepotism laws were passed. Selling spiritual offices became less tolerated. And papal courts were reorganized for stability. In short, the Church looked at the chaos and said, "We cannot keep doing this." Reform was messy, slow, and sometimes painful. But it did happen. The lasting imprint, how scandals shaped culture and imagination. Even though the worst popes died long ago, their impact lives everywhere, especially in culture, art, and popular imagination. 1. The Borgias. Thanks to novels, TV shows, and centuries of gossip, the Borgia family became Hollywood-level villains. Poisoning, backstabbing, seduction, their legend shaped how people imagine papal corruption. 2. The Reformation. Leo X's Indulgence Crisis didn't just annoy Luther, it helped launch an entire new branch of Christianity. Millions of people left the Catholic Church because of corruption that had spiraled out of control. 3. Italian Renaissance politics. Popes like Sixtus IV and Julius II turned Rome into a political battleground that shaped the art we see today. Without their ambition, Florence and Rome wouldn't have become the cultural giants they are. 4. Dante's legacy. When Dante threw popes into hell in the Divine Comedy, he wasn't exaggerating, he was reflecting public frustration. His work cemented the idea that popes could fall far from grace. 5. Modern skepticism of institutions. When people today look at religious or political leaders with suspicion, they're continuing a centuries-old tradition shaped in part by the scandals of the papacy. These popes left their fingerprints on art, politics, literature, and religion, far beyond their own lifetimes. What viewers can take away? Yes, these stories are wild. They're dramatic, messy, sometimes tragic, sometimes darkly funny. But beneath the spectacle, there are real lessons worth keeping. 1. Leadership without accountability fails. Every institution, religious or secular, needs checks and balances. Without them, even good intentions can warp. 2. No position makes someone moral. A title, a robe, a fancy hat, none of these guarantee integrity. Power tests character. 3. Systems matter more than individuals. A system that rewards ambition over virtue will always produce corrupt leaders eventually. 4. History helps us see patterns. Almost every scandal we covered reflects timeless themes. Greed, pride, fear, family ambition, desire for control, lack of transparency. Understanding these patterns helps us spot them today. 5. Critical thinking is essential. Just because someone claims holiness, or power, or destiny, doesn't mean their actions are just. Questioning authority isn't disrespect, it's responsible citizenship. Closing thoughts, a final reflection and a look ahead. As we end this series, remember, the popes we've discussed don't represent the whole church, just the moments when things went off the rails. They teach us not to ignore history, because history warns us about where power can lead when no one stops to ask hard questions. So here's the final takeaway. Power wrapped in holiness is still power. And power must always be watched, questioned, and understood. Thank you for sticking through this journey, full of scandal, drama, humor, and hard truths. If you're ready for more, the next series could be just as wild. Evil kings. Tyrant queens. Dark ages of empires. Corrupt emperors. Nightmare nobles. History has no shortage of drama. And with that, we close this chapter, calm, chill, and wiser about the strange dance between power and human nature.